Okay, here's a revelation. I never really had much experience with the Lord of the Rings trilogy for most of my childhood, save from the cultural osmosis of seeing it on commercials and posters back in the day. There wasn't much internet back then yet, and I'm more of a Harry Potter fan anyway. It wasn't until college when I got to watch the full extended versions of the movie adaptations of the whole trilogy that I actually had my first formal introduction to the franchise, and I loved every second of it. I never really noticed the passage of time while watching a collective of 12 plus hours of cinematic masterpiece. And I honestly think that the Lord of the Rings movies will one day be regarded as a classic that people will enjoy even decades from now. This, plus all the glowing recommendations from fellow bookworms and writers, was why I had very high expectations when I finally got my hands on my own copy of the book in my early 20s. After I read it, though, all I could think of was, that's it. I mean, it's not that bad, but it's not that good either. Before you pick up your pitchforks and tiki torches, hear me out. I understand why The Lord of the Rings is well beloved by a lot of people. It was a masterpiece in its time. It was a pioneer in everything we know and love about the fantasy genre and even literature in general. We owe in part to The Lord of the Rings. However, the keyword there are pioneer and in its time. Because the truth is, The Lord of the Rings was a product of its time and really doesn't stand to modern scrutiny. It's not a perfect masterpiece that's beyond reproach, and I think it's dumb that people who are critical of this literary work have to tread lightly, and I'm here to tell you why.
The Lord of the Rings is overrated.
I will go through it in more detail later, but I think the fact that Tolkien didn't originally mean to write the Lord of the Rings trilogy and instead wanted to explore the history of the world he created is one of the main reasons why, to me, the book is how it is.
The Lord of the Rings is racist.
Oh, yes, I am going there. Okay. To be clear, I am not saying that Tolkien and Lovecraft would have been BFFs in their bigoted ways had they lived in the same era and the same place. After all, he is notoriously anti-Nazi. One of the most popular anecdotes that we have about him was his scathing letter to Hitler after he basically told the late dictator to go fuck himself after he sent him an invitation to visit Nazi Germany. However, that doesn't mean that Tolkien isn't a product of his time. Let's all be honest here. J.R.R. Tolkien grew up in the early 20th century. Everyone, and I do mean everyone, back then is at least a little bit racist. Sometimes. So, to pretend that Tolkien doesn't have even a tiny bit of a racist bone in his body is pretty much wishful thinking for some and disingenuous for others. Much has already been said about his portrayal of orcs, so I don't think I can add more to the conversation on that front, but I do want to talk more about his portrayals of men in Arda. First, I think it's not controversial to say that the Lord of the Rings trilogy is the whitest thing to spread all over the world since British imperialism. I mean, all of our main cast are either from the west or the north of the known world. In fact, in Middle-earth, west means good and east means evil. I mean, think about it. If East really is bad, why was Mordor in the southeasternmost corner of what would have been Europe in the real world instead of the actual easternmost part of the continent? If the furthest from the west means the least influence from the Maiar and the Valar, which are this world's version of God, minor gods and angels, then surely the easternmost part of the Middle-earth's version of the Eurasian continent should be the most ideal domain for a villain.
But Gio, this is supposed to be Tolkien's take on the mythology of Europe in general, and Great Britain in particular. So of course everything's confined to what would correspond to Europe in the real world.
I hear you say. Well, hypothetical audience in the comment section that must be typing aggressively right now. To that, I say, I get that there are plenty of myths and legends from different lands where the opposing divine forces reside in opposite directions, but it doesn't have to be tied to geography. I mean, even in their world, the realm of the gods isn't even in the West anymore. And this ties to the Planet of the Hats trope that this whole epic is so notorious for that it's become such a big issue. Why should everything to the right of Mordor be so easily corruptible? Why didn't any of the people from the east and the south join forces with the men of Gondor and Rohan in the fight against Sauron? I mean, the two blue wizards from Gandalf's order went to the east. Why didn't they factor in the story and maybe coordinate a two-pronged attack against Mordor's forces? So there, the east and the west, at least, could have easily worked together instead of the former being collectively under Sauron's control. Also, really? There are no people of color in Gondor or Rohan and their neighboring lands. I mean, there was a passing mention of trades in between the West and the South back in the day in the books. So it's not impossible that some people from the South could have moved to the West. This happens in the real world, so it's definitely also possible in Middle-earth. Then there's the issue of wild men and half-trolls. Let's talk about the former first. The wild men, or the Druidane, I don't know how to pronounce that, are a race of men that live in the forest surrounding Gondor. They were described as short, stumpy men with wide faces, heavy brows, and flat noses that were driven by evil men into isolation and were even described in universe by elves as unpretty. They were Tolkien's version of the indigenous peoples that used to live in Europe before being driven out by white people. But wait, there's more. The wild men speak little common tongue, although they live in between large groups of people who speak the language. In contrast, the hobbits, who were so far removed from civilization that most people consider them no more than legends until 4 of them went to east to join the fight against Sauron, speak the language fluently. As for half-trolls, no, they're not men-troll abominations in service of Sauron. They're men who live in Far Harad, or in English, Far South. In short, in Tolkien's world, the black people of what would have been Africa in our real world are called half-trolls. There are plenty other instances of racism in Lord of the Rings that I could mention here, but I think this is where I'll stop talking about the topic. For now, let's move on.
The point of view is a confusing mess.
The whole Lord of the Rings saga, including The Hobbit, was supposed to be a transcription and a translation of the collection of notes of Bilbo, Frodo, Sam, and many other people's recollection of what happened at the tail end of the Third Age and the War of the Ring. That means we can assume that the whole book is written in the perspective of the people who could have contributed in writing these notes, meaning the book as a whole is supposed to be written in the third-person limited point of view. So it's jarring to me what every now and then we would get to read something that none of the characters should have known. Not only that, but there were even instances when we are in the head of someone who couldn't have contributed in the Red Book.
But Gio, maybe the POV of the book is third-person omniscient instead of third-person limited.
If that's the case, then why don't we have sections talking about stuff that happened outside the perspectives of the main cast that would have made huge sections of the book so much better to read? There are huge sections of the book where we only hear about what happened from one character, sometimes even as a narration by that same character, instead of actually witnessing it through their eyes in real time when there's no reason for that to be the case if this was written through a third-person omniscient observer.
But Gio, who even cares if the book keeps switching its POV? As long as it works, it's fine.
That's the thing. It doesn't. For example, there's one scene where Frodo was supposed to be feverish and delirious after he was stabbed by one of the Nazgul. However, we will still see and hear what's happening around him through his perspective one moment, and then the next thing you know, it suddenly shifts to an omniscient perspective without any warning. The fact is, the book can't decide which of these two POVs it should use, so it just used both.
The pacing is tediously slow.
It is a well-known fact, even among the most hardcore Tolkien fans, that the pacing of these books is really, really slow. I mean, the amount of time our characters spent just walking from one place to another is already an overused meme by now. Look, I am a sucker for world building and I don't really mind how slow or fast the story is moving into the plot, but at least make the info dumps relevant to the story. Do you really need a chapter and a half of exposition dumps about what the hobbits are, where they live, and what they look like, as well as who has gossip about who and what's being said about whoever, before we can move on to the meat of the story? Tolkien obviously enjoyed fleshing out his world so much that he indulged himself with including lengthy description of stuff that ultimately don't matter. And that's just the prologue and the first chapter of the first book. There are a lot, and I mean a lot, of stuff in it, and the two other parts in the trilogy that can be cut all together and put in the appendices, or any of the many supplementary materials that this franchise has, or not be included at all, and nothing would have changed in the story progression.
But Gio, we do need to hear about those parts. If there's one thing Lord of the Rings is well known for, it's the immersive and deep lore. We can't learn about the lore behind the world without the exposition dumps.
Yes, but there are much more effective way of incorporating expositions that do not take away your engagement in the story. You don't have to insert encyclopedia entries at intervals without it being relevant to the story and then excuse it as world building. If it doesn't matter to the story, you don't have to spend paragraphs and paragraphs rambling on and on about it. Tolkien even managed to do this in some cases. For example, that exposition dump with Treebeard rambling on and on about Ents to Merry and Pippin makes sense because we know that it's been so long since Treebeard had someone to talk to. Thankfully, the pacing isn't as atrocious as in succeeding books, although it definitely still is a problem. This was, I think, where the world building obsession that J.R.R. Tolkien had was the most obvious. I mean, if they wouldn't let him publish the Silmarillion, then by the gods, he will do that through these books. The book is also notorious for violating the show don't tell rule of storytelling. Frodo learned about the whole history of the ring through a freaking interview session with Gandalf. This kept on happening, and as a consequence, the narrative progression suffered. Again, I don't really care about the pacing of the book. Hell, some of my favorite books are so thick they can be used as assault weapons. But there should be a reason why the story would crawl at a glacial pace, and irrelevant info dumps is not the way to do it.
Ex Machina.
Deus Ex Machina in itself is merely a plot device. It doesn't have to be a bad thing. However, if it becomes a crutch and is being used over and over, then there is definitely a problem with the story. Tom Bombadil, the Eagles, Gandalf, and especially Gandalf were so often used as Deus Ex Machina, it's not even fun to read about when it happens anymore. If some powerful being would just swoop over to save our protagonists from inevitable doom out of nowhere, where's the sense of danger?
The characters are boring.
Okay, let's do a roll call. First, the villains. There's the orcs, the spider monkey, the Bond villain with magic, and the over-glorified spotlight with an obsession with the ring. Now for the main cast, we have Merlin 2.0, a racist elf, a racist dwarf, King Arthur with dark hair, that other guy you just know is trouble, and the Ninja Turtles. Now tell me their character arcs. What are their quirks? What are their struggles? What are their motivations? What is stopping them from reaching their goals? How did they differ from where the story started to where they are when it ended? I thought so. Because really, aside from a select few, the characters of these books are so paper thin with only the barest minimum of character progression for some of them. None was this problem more prevalent than with Aragorn. Oh, sweet, sweet Aragorn with your piercing eyes and your chiseled jaws. I hate you. If there's one big thing that the movie changed from the source material for the better, it was to make Aragorn a reluctant hero. Aragorn in the books has no motivations, no struggles, and no goals, save from being the cool guy that's destined to be king. I think he's the worst of all the characters because he serves only as a walking get-out-of-jail-free card along with Gandalf. Gandalf I could forgive because seeing as he's a mentor figure, he's only secondary when it comes to his relevance to the story. But Aragorn? He and Sam and Frodo are arguably the main characters of the whole trilogy. I mean, the last book in the series was named after him.
But Gio, there are characters in the story that do have the stuff we're looking for.
Yes, I know. I think Sam and Frodo are about the only characters that actually had some character arc and fleshed out backstories. Well, story. Frodo was very frustrating to read about, but at least you can see the change in him. And Sam was just a warm cinnamon roll that I would die for. Well, just kill for maybe. I guess Saruman was also interesting. I mean, he opposed the protagonists, but he isn't 100% working for Sauron. He was a free agent that had his own goals and motivations. I like that. I just hope that was explored more. It would have made the story much more engaging and close to realistic. Well, at least as realistic as a story with monsters and a giant head that's obsessed with the ring. Because wars in real life are a lot more nuanced than black and white. Sometimes there are players that have their own agenda that don't necessarily align with the two opposing sides. Also, I didn't really care that Gollum and Sauron don't have any depth in them because they're villains. Being two-dimensional as a villain could work. But if you're the main character, you have to have some substance in you, instead of just being a cardboard cutout of a person. Anyway, next topic.
The Lord of the Rings is kinda sexist.
Hear me out. I already know what you're going to say, and believe me, I will address that. First, let me be clear. Just like with my points about the racism in Lord of the Rings, I am not implying that J.R.R. Tolkien would not be out of place in a group of incels and pickup artists of today. All I'm saying is that Tolkien lived in a time where sexism is just another part of everyday life, so it's not a stretch to think that Tolkien's, well, upbringing and prejudices might have seeped into this text whether or not he was aware of it. Think about it. Name the prominent female figures in the story. There are only 3 prominent characters in the story that are female. 4 if you would count Shelob, and 5 if you count Goldberry, which, to be honest, can we really count Goldberry? The whole fellowship was one big sausage fest. And 3 of the 5 named female characters in the story, Arwen, Goldberry, and Galadriel, are reduced to nothing but pretty faces in the background. Hell, we get passages in the story about how Galadriel and Goldberry are also both powerful in their own right, but whenever someone talks about them, it's always about how pretty they look. Like, even Gimli, bless his soul, won't shut up about how pretty Galadriel is. Then there's Shelob, a monster living in the shadows to ambush unsuspecting men and orcs that find themselves in her lair. Do I really need to explain how that's problematic? Ah yes, my sweet, sweet summer child, Eowyn, who wouldn't take no for an answer and prove that women can fight just as well, if not better than men. I mean, she defeated the one creature that no man can ever defeat. Isn't that worth taking note of? Yeah, until you think about what happened next. She fell in love with Faramir in less than a week of knowing him, forsaking her passion for battle and basically swearing to become a trophy wife. Really? Just 1 week of knowing some guy, you're giving it all up? For dick? I mean, girl, I can relate, but really. So to summarize, in Middle-earth, women are nothing more than pretty ornaments, except when they're a predatory monster who lurks in the shadows. And it's okay to play with the big boy toys as long as you know where you belong at the end of the day.
The world of Arda is okay, I guess.
Like I said earlier, it's very clear that what Tolkien really wanted to do was flesh out the world he created. And it's, in my opinion, the main reason why so much of the book is spent on overly explaining stuff and those freaking songs. What Tolkien clearly sought out to do was immerse himself in the world, and in that regard, I think he was successful. The Hobbit suffers from the same things the main series was suffering from, but it's something I chose to overlook because it was supposed to be a children's book. It's different when it came to the other two books I've read though. I thoroughly enjoyed reading The Children of Húrin and The Silmarillion. I think it's because I'm a sucker for mythology, but there's also a feeling as I'm reading the books that made it seem like there's more, I don't know, heart to it. But yeah, I loved reading The Silmarillion, which is a bummer because Tolkien never did finish polishing the book. Who knows what it could have been if he had been given the chance to focus on it. I plan to read the whole history of Middle-earth someday because despite my complaints about the story of The Lord of the Rings, I did enjoy the time I spent in that world and I want to know more about it. For now though, I really need a break.
Conclusion.
So, is J.R.R. Tolkien a master world builder? Definitely. I 100% agree. But is Lord of the Rings a literary masterpiece that stood the test of time? No. The Lord of the Rings may be considered as one of modern-day classics that we have because of the tropes, archetypes, and themes it pioneered and lent to the works that followed it, but overhyping it and claiming that it's some sort of literary masterpiece that's beyond reproach is nonsense. If it was read with the standards of its time in mind, The Lord of the Rings is an okay book, maybe even a great book. If I read the book with that mindset, I wouldn't have issues with it. In fact, if only its fans aren't as overzealous about The Lord of the Rings, I wouldn't have had so much to say about the books. I would have read them and then just get on with my life without even thinking twice about them.
But Gio, The Lord of the Rings popularized the fantasy genre. It's the inspiration for countless other stories, and the archetypes it pioneered are being used even to this day.
I know, but that doesn't mean that we should glorify it as if it's the epitome of what literature is and that no one can ever surpass its quality. Yes, the archetypes and tropes that it popularized are still present today, but the question is, how are they being used? They're either subverted or improved upon, because those same tropes have been overused and most of the time, terribly executed. If we hold The Lord of the Rings in such a high regard as the inspiration for all fantasy stories, why aren't we doing the same thing for, say, the Epic of Gilgamesh? I don't see anyone worshipping it for being the first known story ever written the way people do for Lord of the Rings. So why do a lot of people hold it to high regard as if it's beyond reproach? If you search Lord of the Rings is bad or overrated or not good on Reddit, the posts you'd find would have 0 to 30 something upvotes. And if you check the comment sections, all the commenters are in defense of the books.
But Gio, maybe the fact that almost nobody else shares your opinion means that you're objectively wrong.
First of all, hi. Thank you for watching this far into the video. Second, that's a fallacious argument to make. I guess I have already made several points that are strong enough and clear enough for even hardcore fans of the work to at least acknowledge. I am not trying to convince you. That's not to say they're perfect though. If you have any clarifications, I welcome them and I'd love to hear them. Anyway, what's my point on all of this? I guess that it's okay not to like The Lord of the Rings, and it's okay to say out loud without fearing that others would attack you or tell you you're wrong for not liking it. And just as much, it's equally totally fine to love the books and to proclaim your love for them to the high heavens. There's a line in between being overly enthusiastic and expressing your love for a work of literature and treating everyone who have opposite opinions with you on that said work as a heretic that must be burned at the stake. Don't ever cross that line.
Post-editing Geo here, and I just want to say thank you for everyone who watched my first ever video on this channel. As you can see, I have a lot to say about The Lord of the Rings in my script, and the video actually ended up so long that I had to cut a lot out of it. So I decided to also release an extended version of my ramblings, which I think is very on brand considering the topic. If you want to listen to more of my rants, please give it a watch and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Toodles!